Dr. Thalassa Quill blinked slowly, her eyelids creaking open with all the grace of a rusty airlock. The ceiling above her was a sterile white, harsh and unfriendly, much like the world she had left behind. She felt a deep chill in her bones, the kind that only comes from spending a century frozen like a particularly disappointing TV dinner. "Great," she muttered, or at least tried to. Her vocal cords were having an existential crisis, and the sound that emerged was more akin to a strangled cat. "I've lived long enough to see the apocalypse again." As she sat up, her joints protested loudly, a symphony of snaps and pops. The room around her was bare, save for the beeping monitors that were either keeping her alive or simply monitoring her demise. The walls were a drab gray, as if someone had tried to paint the essence of boredom itself. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Dr. Quill," a voice crackled through a speaker. It was dry, sardonic, and seemed to have an intimate relationship with sarcasm. "And who might you be? My personal undertaker," Thalassa rasped, rubbing her temples as if that could erase a 100-year headache. "Arcturus. Engineer, Martian native, and the poor soul tasked with babysitting you until you get your bearings." Thalassa surveyed the quarantine chamber with the enthusiasm of someone contemplating a root canal. "Forgive me if I don't leap for joy. What year is it, and why am I not dead yet?" "It's 2153, and you're not dead because apparently humanity decided one apocalypse wasn't enough," Arcturus replied. "But hey, at least the cryogenic process preserved your sparkling personality." Thalassa gave a humorless chuckle as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet made contact with the cold floor, and she shivered. "So what's the latest disaster? Plague? Nuclear winter? Did the Kardashians finally achieve world domination?" "Close," Arcturus said, his voice crackling like static. "Aliens, shape-shifting aliens to be precise. They infiltrated the government while you were napping." Thalassa raised an eyebrow, the only part of her face that didn't feel like it had been put through a meat grinder. "Aliens? Shape-shifting ones? That sounds a lot like the plot of a B-movie I once fell asleep during." "Yeah, well, life's a B-movie now," Arcturus replied. "And you're the starring scientist who might have the keys to saving humanity." "Oh, joy," Thalassa sighed, glancing at her reflection in a nearby monitor. She looked about as alive as a ghost with a hangover. "I always wanted to save the world in my pajamas." "Good news on that front," Arcturus said. "We've got fresh clothes for you. Bad news is they're not designer." "I suppose I'll survive," Thalassa replied dryly. "So what's your story, Arcturus, besides being my reluctant guardian angel?" "I was born here on Mars, never seen Earth," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of pride and disdain. "Which means I've got a better tan and a worse sense of humor." "I was going to comment on that tan," Thalassa said, attempting to stand. Her legs wobbled like a newborn giraffe. "So, any chance you've got coffee in this post-apocalyptic hellscape?" "Coffee? We've got the Martian equivalent, which is to say, it's awful," Arcturus replied. "But it'll wake you up." Thalassa took a deep breath, or rather attempted to, as her lungs were still defrosting. "All right, let's talk aliens. What do they want? Besides starring roles in our governmental soap opera." "Control, chaos, free cable. I don't know," Arcturus admitted. "They're good at playing human, which is more than I can say for some of the actual humans around here." "So, what do we do about them, short of asking them politely to leave?" Thalassa asked, rubbing her eyes. "Well, that's where you come in, Doc," Arcturus said. "Some of your old research might hold the answer." "Something about a prototype detection system." "I remember something like that," Thalassa said, her memory still foggy as a Martian dust storm. "It's not exactly field-ready," Arcturus snorted. "Nothing is, but we're rolling the dice here. Welcome to the new normal." Thalassa groaned as she finally managed to stand upright. "All right, lead the way, guide of the damned. Let's see if we can't kick some alien ass before lunch." The door to the quarantine chamber slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing Arcturus in the flesh. He was tall, lean, and had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen too much and slept too little. His hair was a mess of dark curls, and his eyes held the weary amusement of someone who'd learned to laugh at disaster. "Nice to finally meet you in person," Thalassa said, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. "Likewise," Arcturus replied, extending a hand. His grip was firm, grounding her in a reality that felt more like fiction with every passing second. They walked through a series of corridors that seemed to have been designed by someone with a grudge against color. Everything was steel and concrete, utilitarian and soul-crushing. "So, who do we trust in this brave new world?" Thalassa asked as they moved. "Trust? That's a laugh," Arcturus said. "I've got a short list, me, maybe you, and definitely not that vending machine in the break room. It ate my credits." "I'll keep that in mind," Thalassa said, suppressing a chuckle. They reached a lab that looked like it had been abandoned mid-experiment. Equipment lay scattered, and the air was thick with the smell of chemicals and desperation. "Home sweet home," Arcturus said with a sweep of his hand. "Charming," Thalassa replied, eyeing a particularly dubious-looking contraption. "So, where's this miracle device of mine?" "Over there," Arcturus said, pointing to a dusty corner where a collection of cables and circuit boards lay like the aftermath of a robot party gone wrong. Thalassa approached the pile, her fingers tingling with the promise of purpose. "Looks like I've got some work to do." "You and me both," Arcturus said. "I'll get the coffee." As he left the lab, Thalassa sat at a workstation, booting up an ancient computer that wheezed like it was on life support. The screen flickered to life, and she began sifting through files, the past meeting the present in a clumsy dance. "Why did I ever think cryogenics was a good idea?" she muttered to herself, fingers flying across the keyboard. The answer was simple, really, a desperate hope for a better future. Instead, she got aliens and a Martian babysitter with a penchant for sarcasm. Arcturus returned with 2 steaming cups of something that resembled coffee if you squinted hard enough. "Brewed this myself," he said, handing her a cup. "It's lethal, but it'll get you through a workday." Thalassa took a cautious sip, wincing at the bitterness. "I've tasted worse." "But not by much." "High praise," Arcturus chuckled, taking a sip from his own cup. "So what's the plan, Doc?" "First, we get this system running," Thalassa said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Then we find out which of our friends are actually foes." Arcturus leaned against a desk, crossing his arms. "And then we save the world," Thalassa smirked, a spark of determination in her eyes. Something like that. The hours passed in a blur of code and circuits, 2 unlikely allies working in tandem to unlock the secrets of a device that could tip the balance in humanity's favor. The air was thick with tension, but beneath it lay the unyielding resolve of those who had nothing left to lose. "You know," Arcturus said, breaking the silence, "when I was a kid, I always thought I'd grow up to be a hero. Save the damsel, slay the dragon, all that nonsense. And how's that working out for you?" Thalassa asked without looking up from her work. "Turns out the damsel's a scientist with a bad attitude and the dragon's an alien shapeshifter," Arcturus replied with a wry grin. "Welcome to reality," Thalassa said, glancing at him with a hint of a smile. "It's overrated, but it's all we've got." Arcturus chuckled, shaking his head. "Here's to saving the world, one sarcastic comment at a time." As they worked, the sense of camaraderie between them grew, forged in the fires of necessity and tempered by the kind of humor that only comes from staring into the abyss. The world outside might have been crumbling, but here, in this makeshift lab, there was a glimmer of hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thalassa leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. "I think I've got it," she said, a mixture of triumph and exhaustion in her voice. Arcturus straightened, eyes narrowing. "You sure?" "As sure as I can be," Thalassa replied, reaching for a switch on the device. The machine hummed to life, a low, steady sound that resonated through the room. "Let's see if it works," Arcturus said, his tone serious now. Thalassa flipped a few more switches, her fingers deft and sure. "Moment of truth," she murmured. The screen flickered, lines of code scrolling past before settling into a stable pattern. A map appeared, dots representing known individuals within the quarantine zone. "This should show us any anomalies," Thalassa explained, her eyes scanning the data. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, a few dots began to pulse with a faint, irregular glow. "Looks like we've got some uninvited guests," Arcturus said, his voice tinged with grim satisfaction. Thalassa nodded, her expression one of grim determination. "Now we just have to figure out what to do with them." Arcturus leaned closer to the screen, his gaze intense. "I say we give them a proper Martian welcome." "And what's that?" Thalassa asked, arching an eyebrow. "A swift kick in the ass," Arcturus replied, a fierce grin spreading across his face. Thalassa chuckled, shaking her head. "Sounds like a plan I can get behind." As they stood there, side by side, staring at the pulsing dots on the screen, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, the kind that precedes a storm. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but for the first time since awakening in this alien-haunted world, Thalassa felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: a purpose. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice steady. Arcturus nodded, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Let's." And with that they turned back to the screen, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead in this broken world they were determined to save. Arcturus ran his hand through his hair, a futile attempt at taming a mess that looked like it had been styled by an electrical storm. "All right, Doc, before we go all gung-ho, maybe we take a stroll through our lovely quarantine zone. Get the lay of the land. Might find a hint about how deep these alien bastards have their claws in us." "Sounds like a plan," Thalassa replied, squinting at the map with its constellation of pulsing dots. "And if we're lucky, we won't need a machete to cut through the bullshit." They stepped out into the corridor, the air thick with the tension of 1,000 potential disasters. The quarantine zone was a glorified bunker, a labyrinth of steel and concrete built by optimists who believed humanity could survive its own stupidity. The walls were adorned with motivational posters that had long since lost their motivation, leaving only faded platitudes like "hang in there," next to a picture of a cat that looked as weary as Thalassa felt. "So," Thalassa said, her voice echoing down the corridor, "what's the deal with Earth these days? Still a dumpster fire, or have things improved?" "Depends on your definition of improvement," Arcturus replied, the corners of his mouth twitching into a smirk. "Some folks say it's an ecological paradise now, but that's just 'cause no one's left to screw it up." "Ah, the post-human utopia. Sounds idyllic." "Sure, if you like radioactive sunsets and mutant wildlife," Arcturus said, leading the way past a storage room that smelled like something had died and been resurrected as a public health hazard. They reached a heavy door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," which, given the current state of affairs, likely meant them. Arcturus punched in a code, and the door slid open with a reluctant groan, revealing a control room that looked like it had seen better days, probably in the last century. "Welcome to the Nerve Center," Arcturus announced, waving a hand at the banks of flickering monitors and panels that looked like they'd been cobbled together from a scrapyard. "Home to the finest technology Martian money can buy." I'd complain, but considering I was a popsicle until recently, this feels downright cutting edge, Thalassa said, eyeing a monitor that displayed what could generously be called a map of the quarantine zone. Arcturus tapped a few buttons, bringing up a screen filled with lines of text and images. "All right, let's see what the aliens have been up to." They combed through the data, uncovering a litany of manipulations that spanned decades. Political coups that had smelled fishy even then, technological advancements that seemed to leapfrog human understanding, and societal shifts that felt too orchestrated to be mere coincidence. "Well, this is just great," Thalassa muttered, massaging her temples. "It's like a greatest hits album of human screw-ups, remixed by aliens." "Yeah, and they didn't even bother to change the liner notes," Arcturus added, scrolling past reports of influential figures and decisions that had been nudged, ever so gently, by extraterrestrial hands. "So, what's the plan?" "Go public, blow the lid off this whole thing?" Thalassa asked, her voice tinged with both hope and the dread of knowing plans rarely survived first contact with reality. Arcturus nodded grimly. Yeah, that's the idea. Broadcast the truth, rally whatever's left of humanity that can still think for themselves. Assuming anyone's left out there to listen, Thalassa replied, her cynicism rearing its head. Guess there's only one way to find out, Arcturus said, moving towards the communications array with the grim determination of a man about to punch a bear in the face. The console was a masterpiece of obsolete tech, wires spilling from its guts like the entrails of some unlucky beast. Arcturus went to work, fingers dancing over controls that were more temperamental than a toddler on a sugar high. All right, let's see if we can reach Earth, he said, flipping a switch that spat a shower of sparks in protest. The console flickered to life, a series of beeps and clicks forming some semblance of communication. Static filled the air, broken by the occasional snatch of unintelligible words, proof that somewhere out there, someone was still broadcasting. Looks promising, Thalassa said, crossing her arms. Of course, promising in this context means it hasn't exploded yet. Arcturus grinned, though there was no humor in it. Let's hope it holds long enough for us to do our thing. As they worked to establish a stable link, Thalassa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a creeping sensation that set her nerves on edge. You ever get the feeling we're not alone? More than I like, Arcturus replied, tapping a sequence into the console. But hey, maybe it's just friendly aliens looking to borrow a cup of sugar. Thalassa chuckled, though the sound was devoid of amusement. Considering how things have been going, they'd probably take the whole kitchen. Finally, the static cleared long enough for a voice to come through, tinny and distant, like a ghost whispering through a rusted speaker. This is Earth Command. Identify yourself. Arcturus exchanged a glance with Thalassa, a flicker of triumph passing between them. This is Mars Station Quarantine Alpha. We've got intel on alien activities manipulating human history. You need to hear this. There was a pause, the kind that stretched thin as the hope tethered to it. Then the voice crackled back, laced with skepticism. Acknowledged Mars Station. Transmission received. Stand by for verification. Verification? Thalassa scoffed, rolling her eyes. What are they gonna do, send us a questionnaire? Probably want to make sure we're not a bunch of tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists, Arcturus replied, though his tone was anything but optimistic. Minutes ticked by, each one heavy with the weight of anticipation and the bitter aftertaste of doubt. The silence was oppressive, filled only by the soft hum of electronics and the distant creaks of a station that seemed poised to collapse under its own history. And then, without warning, the console burst into a cacophony of alarms, a symphony of chaos that sent Arcturus scrambling to stabilize it. What the hell? Thalassa stared at the screens, her heart sinking as she realized the source of the disruption. We've been compromised, she said, her voice hollow. Arcturus cursed under his breath, fingers flying over the controls as he fought to regain control. They're jamming us, those crafty bastards. The line went dead, plunging them back into silence, a silence that now felt like the pause before an executioner's axe fell. So much for our moment of glory, Thalassa muttered, her frustration barely contained. Arcturus slammed his fist onto the console, the impact sending another spray of sparks into the air. Damn it, we were so close. Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, Thalassa replied, bitterness creeping into her tone. Now what? Arcturus sighed, running a hand through his hair again, the gesture more out of habit than purpose. We regroup, figure out another way. Maybe there's a line they haven't cut yet. Or maybe we go analog, Thalassa suggested, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Smoke signals, anyone? Arcturus barked a laugh, the sound harsh and mirthless. Yeah, because nothing says urgent message like a puff of smoke on the horizon. We'll figure something out, Thalassa said, though the assurance felt paper-thin. We have to. Yeah, Arcturus agreed, though the weight of the task ahead loomed large between them. The reality of their situation settled in, a cold, unwelcome presence in the room. They were up against forces that had been playing this game for far longer than either of them had been alive, and the odds were stacked like a house of cards in a hurricane. But for all its bleakness, there was a thread of stubborn defiance woven through their resolve, the kind of defiance that refuses to roll over and die, even when death seems the only possible outcome. "All right, Doc," Arcturus said, the determination in his voice rekindling, smoldering embers in the ashes of their failed attempt. "Let's figure out our next move." Thalassa nodded, turning back to the console, the gleam of challenge sparking in her eyes. They'd been knocked down, but they hadn't been knocked out. Not yet. And as long as they drew breath, there was still a chance, a slim, laughable chance, to turn the tide. As they worked, the familiar banter resumed, each quip and sarcastic remark a small act of rebellion against the odds stacked against them. They were bruised but unbroken, weary but not defeated, and together they formed a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. The path forward was shrouded in uncertainty, a twisting labyrinth of potential pitfalls and lurking threats. But they faced it with the grim determination of those who have nothing left to lose, their resolve honed sharp by the fires of adversity. In the end, it was the laughter in the face of despair, the gallows humor shared between comrades on the brink, that lit their way, a reminder that as long as they could still laugh, they hadn't truly lost. "Let's get to it," Thalassa said, her voice steady and sure. Arcturus nodded, his grin fierce and unyielding. "Let's." And with that, they plunged back into the fray, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead in this fractured world they were determined to save. Thalassa and Arcturus huddled over the console, more out of necessity than affection for the antique tech. The room was dim, the kind of lighting one might expect in a morgue, a place that barely cared if you were dead or alive. The monitors flickered erratically, casting jumpy shadows that danced like ghosts with bad rhythm. "Well, isn't this just a cozy little slice of hell?" Arcturus muttered, eyes glued to the screen. He was trying to coax a bit more life out of the battered equipment, but like a hungover bartender, it wasn't pouring out any miracles today. Thalassa smirked. "At least hell has central heating. This place is more like purgatory's waiting room." They both knew the real temperature was set by the alien hand squeezing Earth's throat. The quarantine zone's forgotten corridors were their only refuge now, and the thought wasn't exactly warming. "Ever wonder if there's an alien head honcho out there, laughing at us right now?" Thalassa asked, tapping a button that responded only out of sheer spite. "If there is, he's probably got a playlist called Humans Screwing Up, the deluxe edition, and we're the bonus track," Arcturus replied, his fingers still dancing over the keys. The screen suddenly went black, then flickered back on with a new image, a dark, featureless face staring back at them. It was Obsidian, the alien operative whose reputation was as shadowy as his moniker. "Ah, and here I thought we were having such a lovely evening," Arcturus drawled, leaning back with a sigh that suggested he'd much rather be anywhere else. "Dr. Quill, Mr. Arcturus," Obsidian's voice was a silken hiss, the kind of sound you'd expect from a snake trying its hand at asthma. "You've been causing quite the stir." "Well, someone has to clean up your mess," Thalassa shot back, crossing her arms. "Though I doubt you have a suggestion box." Obsidian's face remained impassive, as if carved from the very shadows that named him. "Consider this your only warning. Cease your interference or face the consequences." Arcturus looked at Thalassa, raising a brow. "Consequences? Sounds like a Friday night back home." "Where was home, anyway? A prison," Thalassa replied before addressing Obsidian. "What exactly do you want from us, Shadow Man?" Obsidian's eyes seemed to narrow, though it could have just been a trick of the light. "Your compliance, voluntary or otherwise." "Otherwise, huh?" Arcturus leaned forward, his grin feral. "You know, I've always wondered what it'd be like to go out in a blaze of glory. Or just a blaze," Thalassa added, her tone wry. "Never know, with our luck." The screen went dark again, Obsidian's presence evaporating like a bad dream, leaving behind the scent of something worse. Thalassa and Arcturus exchanged a glance, the weight of their dilemma settling in like a bad hangover. "So what's the plan now, partner?" Thalassa asked, feeling that familiar knot of urgency tightening in her gut. Well, I overheard mention of a secret exit, Arcturus said, shrugging. But then again, I also overheard someone say pigs could fly. Thalassa nodded. So, a long shot, our specialty. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls like a drumbeat of impending doom. The labyrinthine structure of the quarantine zone was both a blessing and a curse, a tangled mess that might hide them just long enough to escape or get them lost for eternity. Ever feel like a rat in a maze? Arcturus asked, peering around a corner before motioning for Thalassa to follow. Only every day since I woke up, she replied, keeping her voice low. But hey, at least we're good at sniffing out cheese. They ducked into another corridor only to be met with a dead end. It seemed that fate had a twisted sense of humor and it wasn't on their side today. Looks like we're not getting out of here that easily, Arcturus said, eyeing the blank wall with the intensity of a man trying to will it into a door. Thalassa chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. Of course not. That would be too simple. Their banter was interrupted by the sound of footsteps, heavy, purposeful, and getting closer. They exchanged a quick glance, the kind that said more than words ever could. It was time to move, and fast. Turning on their heels, they raced down the hall, the pounding of their hearts matching the rhythm of their feet. The station was a maze of metal and shadow, each turn a gamble that could lead them closer to freedom or into the jaws of their pursuer. Is it just me, or does running for your life get old real quick? Thalassa asked, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Tell me about it, Arcturus replied, his voice slightly strained. But it's one hell of a cardio workout. They rounded another corner, only to find themselves face to face with a figure that seemed to melt out of the shadows, obsidian, calm and unruffled as ever. Persistent, aren't we? He drawled, his tone dripping with condescension. Like a bad rash, Thalassa shot back, holding her ground. Sorry, but we're not ready to throw in the towel just yet. Obsidian took a step forward, his posture menacing. You can't outrun me forever. We're not running, Arcturus said, stepping alongside Thalassa. We're just working on our dramatic exits. The air was thick with tension, a silent countdown to something explosive. Every instinct screamed at them to flee, to fight, to do something, anything, but give in. So what now? Thalassa murmured, her gaze never leaving Obsidian's. Now, Arcturus said, his voice a low growl, we make our move. Without another word, they sprang into action, charging forward with the reckless abandon of those with nothing left to lose. Obsidian moved to intercept them, but they were ready, ducking past him like shadows slipping through cracks. The chase was on again, their footsteps a frantic staccato against the backdrop of the station. Behind them, Obsidian pursued, a relentless force that refused to be shaken off. This way, Arcturus called, veering toward a side passage that promised, if nothing else, a temporary reprieve. Thalassa followed, adrenaline lending her speed as they darted through the narrow corridor. Their path was a blur of metal and dim light, the walls closing in around them like the maw of some great beast. They're gonna have to do better than this to catch us, Thalassa said, trying to inject some levity into their desperate flight. Yeah, Arcturus agreed, his voice tinged with weary determination. But let's not stick around to see if they do. They burst into a larger chamber, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows across the floor. For a heartbeat, they paused, scanning their surroundings for any sign of salvation. There, Thalassa pointed to a maintenance hatch set into the floor, its edges rusted with age. That might be our ticket out, or a one-way trip to a very unpleasant surprise, Arcturus countered, though he was already moving to pry the hatch open. Well, I've always been a fan of surprises, Thalassa said with a grim smile, helping him lift the heavy cover. Once the hatch was open, they peered inside, finding a narrow shaft that led into darkness. It was far from an ideal escape route, but at this point beggars couldn't be choosers. Ready? Arcturus asked, glancing over at Thalassa. Ready as I'll ever be, she replied, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. With one final look at each other, they slipped into the shaft, vanishing into the inky blackness below. The hatch clanged shut above them, sealing them off from the world above and whatever fate Obsidian had in store. As they descended into the unknown, the oppressive weight of the station above faded, replaced by the oppressive weight of uncertainty. But even in the heart of the darkness, a flicker of hope ignited in their chests, a defiant spark that refused to be snuffed out. "I don't know about you," Thalassa whispered, her voice barely audible in the cramped space, "but I'm starting to think we might just make it out of this after all." Arcturus chuckled softly, the sound echoing off the close walls. "You know what? I think you might be right." And so they continued their descent, two fugitives against a galaxy that had long since turned its back on them. But they pressed on with the grim determination of those who knew that as long as they kept moving, as long as they kept fighting, there was still a chance, a slim, laughable chance, to turn the tide. And if in the end they failed, well, at least they'd go out swinging. The shaft they'd slid into was narrow enough to make a claustrophobe out of even the most seasoned spelunker. Each rung felt like it was conspiring to send them plummeting into the abyss below. It was, Thalassa thought, a metaphor for her life ever since she'd been thawed, one precarious step after another, with doom lurking just around the corner. "Well," Arcturus grunted, hauling himself downward with the enthusiasm of a man on his way to a root canal, "at least we're getting plenty of practice at avoiding horrible deaths. Maybe we should put that on our resumes," Thalassa quipped, adjusting her grip on the ladder. "Professional escapers of imminent demise." "Think it pays well?" Arcturus asked, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "Only in adrenaline and existential dread," she replied, her eyes catching a faint glow below. Her heart leapt, a light at the end of the tunnel that didn't involve a train. They dropped into an ancient Martian facility, a relic from a time when humanity was still optimistic enough to think they could colonize a planet without screwing it up. The place looked like it had seen better days, possibly in the same era as disco. "Home sweet home," Thalassa muttered, dusting off her hands. "Do you think they left the lights on for us? If they did, it's probably to watch us trip over something and die," Arcturus retorted, eyeing the rust-covered panels with suspicion. "So what's the plan? Besides not getting killed by tetanus?" "We need to amplify our signal. Get a message to Earth," Thalassa said, scanning the room. "If there's any tech left here that hasn't rusted into oblivion, it could give us a fighting chance." "Ah, the classic hope the ancient tech hasn't crapped out on us plan. Bold move," Arcturus said, rolling his shoulders like a prize fighter about to enter the ring. "Got any better ideas?" Thalassa shot back, already knowing the answer. Desperation had a way of making even the most harebrained scheme seem like a stroke of genius. Arcturus gave her a lopsided grin. "Not a one. Let's do this." They moved cautiously through the facility, each step echoing like a harbinger of their doom. The corridors were lined with defunct consoles and monitors that flickered sporadically, casting shadows that danced like ominous specters. "Bet this place was state-of-the-art back in the day," Arcturus commented, poking a console that belched a cloud of dust in response. "Yeah, back when everyone thought they'd be having brunch on Mars," Thalassa replied, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling of being watched. "Turns out brunch is still a thing, but now it's just a code word for rationed can of beans." Their exploration came to an abrupt halt as they turned a corner and stumbled upon what could only be described as a technological relic, a large, ominous control hub, complete with a chair that looked straight out of a sci-fi horror flick. "Well, that's inviting," Arcturus said, nodding at the chair. Thalassa shrugged. "I mean, I've seen worse. Once watched a clown-themed horror movie. This is nothing." The real problem, however, lurked just beyond the facility's defenses. Alien drones hovered silently, their sleek forms practically humming with malice. They were like the universe's worst security system, designed to ensure that whatever secrets the Martians had left behind stayed buried. "Well, that's a pickle," Arcturus said, eyeing the drones with the wary look of a man considering whether a bear might be friendly after all. "Yeah, and we're the idiots with a jar opener," Thalassa replied, trying to assess their options. We need a plan and fast. Arcturus rubbed his chin, his eyes scanning the room like a gambler calculating odds. How good are you at charades? Thalassa blinked. Charades. You want to play games with drones that could vaporize us quicker than you can say oops, not play fake. Look at the layout, Arcturus said, pointing toward the consoles and the drones. We can use the old switcheroo, draw them away and slip past. Thalassa's eyes narrowed as she considered the idea. It was audacious, reckless, and almost certainly doomed to fail. But then, what wasn't these days? All right, let's go with your suicide mission. Arcturus grinned like a kid let loose in a candy store. That's the spirit. You create a distraction, and I'll work my magic on the controls. With a tentative plan in place, Thalassa set about creating chaos. It wasn't difficult. Chaos seemed to follow her around like a particularly persistent stray. She began by knocking over a stack of old metal crates, sending them clattering across the floor. As expected, the drones reacted immediately, zipping toward the noise with all the enthusiasm of overzealous mall cops. Guess they don't get many visitors, Thalassa muttered, keeping their attention as she backed away slowly. Maybe they just want to check my ID. While Thalassa played the part of the unwelcome guest, Arcturus ducked behind the consoles, his fingers flying over the archaic interface with the skill of someone who'd spent far too much time around outdated tech. Dear gods of obsolete technology, Arcturus murmured, please let this thing have some juice left. He worked quickly, bypassing systems that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. The facility's old machinery groaned in protest, but it flickered obligingly to life, lights blinking as if waking from a long slumber. Looks like someone left the keys in the ignition, Arcturus whispered to himself, suppressing the urge to cackle like a mad scientist. Thalassa, meanwhile, had her hands full keeping the drones occupied. They hovered menacingly, their sensors sweeping the area like digital vultures. She threw a wrench across the room, the clang loud enough to draw their attention, and ducked behind a support beam. Come on, you oversized Roombas, she muttered, daring a glance over her shoulder. I'm not that interesting. Back at the console, Arcturus had managed to bring up a schematic of the facility. It wasn't pretty, half the systems were marked as non-functional, but he found what he needed, a communications relay. Thalassa, he called out quietly, knowing full well shouting would bring the drones down on his head. Got the comms online. It's now or never. Thalassa glanced back at him, weighing her options. She could continue playing hide-and-seek with death or make a break for the console. Option 2 seemed slightly less suicidal, so she bolted toward Arcturus, adrenaline fueling her sprint. Arcturus quickly initiated the sequence to amplify their signal, praying that the ancient tech wouldn't choose this moment to give up the ghost. The drones, now realizing the ruse, converged on their position, moving with the kind of precision that made military parades look sloppy. Clock's ticking over here, Thalassa said, watching as the drones closed in. Just a few more seconds, Arcturus muttered through gritted teeth, his fingers dancing over the controls with a speed that belied his casual demeanor. And done, the signal burst forth, a beacon to the stars, as clear and strong as they could make it. They could only hope that someone somewhere was listening. Now we run, Arcturus said, not waiting for her reply as he took off toward the next corridor. Thalassa was right behind him, her feet pounding the floor as they sprinted back the way they'd come. The drones, now fully alerted, gave chase, their mechanical hum a dissonant symphony of doom. They vaulted over debris and ducked through doorways, the sound of pursuit ever present. The facility that had seemed so empty before now felt claustrophobic, each corner a potential death trap. Ever get the feeling you're the mouse and the cat's got wings? Thalassa asked, her breath ragged as they skidded around a corner. Only every time I've run from something that wants to kill me, Arcturus replied, his own breath coming in sharp bursts. Which, surprisingly, is a lot. As they reached a section of the facility that seemed less decrepit, Arcturus spotted a service elevator. It was a gamble. It could lead to safety or straight into a trap, but they were short on options and shorter on time. "This way," he shouted, slamming the button with the urgency of a man who just realized he'd left the oven on. The doors slid open, revealing an interior that, while dusty, appeared functional. They both piled in, Arcturus jabbing the controls with the fervor of a man hoping for a miracle. The elevator jolted to life, the sensation of movement almost a relief. Almost. Thalassa leaned against the wall, catching her breath. "Think they'll follow us?" "Probably," Arcturus said. "But at least we'll make them work for it." The elevator ascended, carrying them away from the immediate threat. It was a brief respite, but in their world you took what you could get. They both knew the game wasn't over. Obsidian and his ilk wouldn't let their prey slip away so easily. "Ever wonder if we're just delaying the inevitable?" Thalassa asked, her tone as dry as the Martian dust they'd left behind. "Sure," Arcturus replied with a shrug. "But hey, the longer we delay, the more time we have to come up with a really good last line." Thalassa chuckled, despite herself. "Yeah, I guess I could live with that." The elevator shuddered to a halt, the doors sliding open to reveal another corridor, this one leading toward the facility's outer perimeter. A few more steps, a few more gambles, and they might just break free. They stepped out, the oppressive silence of the facility once again enveloping them. But now there was a flicker of hope, however faint, that maybe, just maybe, they weren't entirely doomed. "So what do we do now?" Thalassa asked, already knowing the answer. "We keep moving," Arcturus said, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, "and pray that somewhere out there someone picked up our call." And so, with the Martian facility behind them and the unknown stretching out before them, they pressed on. Two survivors, against the odds, against the universe, but still fighting, still hoping. Because in the end, the only thing more persistent than their enemies was their refusal to give up. And that, for now, was enough. The elevator doors opened to reveal a corridor that looked only slightly less like a graveyard for technology than the last. Arcturus and Thalassa stepped out, their shoes echoing in the hollow silence. Behind them, the elevator hummed apologetically back into its shaft, as if even it was embarrassed to be part of this mess. "Well, here we are," Thalassa said, gesturing to the dreary passageway. "Another lovely crumbling relic of humanity's glorious past." Arcturus glanced around, unimpressed. "I always wanted to take a vacation in a tomb." "Really, this is just ticking all the boxes for me." They moved forward cautiously, the distant hum of drones somewhere behind them a constant reminder that a quick death was only a wrong step away. The facility stretched out like a bad joke, punchline just out of reach. Every corridor looked the same, gray, lined with flickering lights, occasionally adorned with a motivational poster that had given up trying to inspire decades ago. "I'm starting to think the Martians had a thing for dystopian chic," Thalassa said, eyeing a poster that proclaimed, "Tomorrow is what you make it," in faded letters. "Either that or they were just as optimistic as we were stupid," Arcturus replied. "They probably thought we'd be sipping cocktails on the red sands by now." They continued through the bleak maze, their senses on high alert. The air was chilly, a stark contrast to the sweat trickling down their backs. Every sound seemed magnified, a creak of metal, the distant whir of machinery long past its sell-by date, their own breath echoing off the walls. "So, got any more bright ideas?" Thalassa asked. "Or are we just going to hope our signal reached someone who's not interested in probing us?" Arcturus smirked. "You mean you don't like a bit of adventure? I thought getting thawed out of a popsicle was your big debut into the world of madness and mayhem." "More like a frozen dinner, really," Thalassa replied dryly. "And I'm pretty sure I was past my expiration date by the time they got me out." They rounded another corner, finding themselves in a room that was marginally more interesting than the others. It housed a collection of rusty tools and strange gadgets, an engineer's paradise or a hoarder's worst nightmare, depending on how one looked at it. Arcturus's eyes lit up with a strange gleam. "Well, what do we have here?" he muttered, picking up a device that looked like it was cobbled together by a child with a penchant for duct tape and wires. Thalassa watched him curiously. Please tell me you're not about to build a bomb. I'd like to live long enough to die of something that doesn't involve immediate disintegration." Arcturus chuckled, tinkering with the device. "Relax. I've got a knack for mechanical improvisation. This baby could help us. Help us how? By blowing us into a fine mist. No, by giving us an edge." He gestured to the device, which now emitted a low hum. "This is a frequency disruptor. With a bit of luck, it might just screw with the drone's sensors long enough to give us a lead." Thalasser raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought you were just a pretty face. Clearly, I've been holding back," Arcturus said with a wink. "But it's going to take a few minutes to tweak this properly." "Great," Thalasser sighed, keeping an eye on the corridor. "I'll just stand here and do my best impression of a sitting duck." As Arcturus busied himself with his gadgetry, Thalasser watched the shadows like a hawk, her mind a whirl of grim possibilities. The facility felt like it was closing in on them, each second ticking down like a bomb. But if there was one thing centuries of human disasters had taught her, it was that resilience often came from the most unexpected places, like an engineer with a knack for turning junk into miracles. "Got it," Arcturus announced, holding up the frequency disruptor with a triumphant grin. "Ready to make a break for it?" "About as ready as I'll ever be," Thalasser replied, taking a deep breath. "Let's dance with death." Arcturus activated the device, the air around them buzzing as it sent out a wave designed to mess with alien metal minds. The faint hum of the drones nearby shifted, their precision wavering like a drunk at a wedding. "Move your feet," Arcturus said, already heading for the door. They bolted down the corridor, the disruptor's field trailing behind them. As they ran, the drones faltered, their path erratic, as if they'd suddenly developed a taste for improvisational dance. "Works like a charm," Thalasser said, breathless but impressed. "Maybe you should have been an inventor." "I prefer creative genius," Arcturus said, dodging a low-hanging pipe. "But I'll take inventor if it means we live through this." They raced through the labyrinth, the facility a blur of gray and shadow. Behind them, the drones struggled to keep pace, their sensors feeding them a merry mix of nonsense. "Just a little further," Arcturus urged, spotting a door that might lead to the facility's outer boundary. "If we can get outside, we might be able to lose them." The door loomed ahead, a heavy slab of metal that promised either salvation or a new set of problems. Arcturus reached it first, skidding to a stop and slamming his fist against the control panel. The door groaned in protest but began to open, revealing a sliver of twilight beyond. "Come on," he shouted, waving Thalasser forward. "This is our exit." They slipped through the gap, the cold Martian air hitting them like a slap. The landscape beyond was barren, a stretch of red earth under a sky that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Made it," Thalasser gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "Now what? We can't outrun them forever." "No," Arcturus agreed, surveying the desolate terrain. "But we can make it damn hard for them to find us." They moved away from the facility, blending into the rocky landscape. Behind them, the facility loomed like a tombstone, a reminder of what awaited if they faltered. But for now, they'd bought themselves time, precious, fleeting moments to plan their next move. "Feel like sharing any more of those genius ideas?" Thalasser asked, her voice tinged with both hope and exhaustion. Arcturus chuckled, though there was a hint of grim determination in his eyes. "I've got a few tricks left up my sleeve, but first we find some cover and figure out our next steps." They trudged across the Martian soil, the weight of their situation hanging over them like a dark cloud. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was a spark, a flicker of hope that refused to be snuffed out. "Ever get the feeling that life's just one big cosmic joke?" Thalasser asked, glancing at the horizon. "All the time," Arcturus replied. "But hey, at least we're the punchline, right?" They walked on, two unlikely allies in a universe that seemed determined to grind them into dust. Yet as long as they drew breath, they would keep fighting, keep hoping, and keep laughing in the face of the abyss. Because if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was being stubbornly, defiantly alive. As Thalasser and Arcturus trudged across the barren Martian landscape, the chill biting through their suits like an ex-lover's scorn. They were acutely aware of the ticking clock. Not that they had an actual clock, of course. All they had was the mental countdown that comes with being hunted by aliens who'd rather see your insides on the outside. Well, that was invigorating, Thalassa wheezed, trying to catch her breath. Do you think we've finally upgraded from clowns to contenders, or are we still just the universe's favorite joke? Arcturus gave a lopsided grin, the kind that said he had long ago made peace with the cosmic dreadful humor. If we're the joke, I'd love to meet the punchline. Maybe they're hiring. Their banter was a thin veneer over the knowledge that their situation was grim. Obsidian, the shape-shifting alien operative with a reputation darker than a black hole's basement, was somewhere behind them, probably closing in, probably ready to turn their lives into a cautionary tale about what happens when you mix humans with Martian ruins. Speaking of job openings, Arcturus said as they ducked behind a rock formation, "What was your career plan before you got popsicle-fied?" Thalassa snorted. "Oh, you know, the usual. Cure cancer, save the world, find a decent Thai place in the middle of Kansas." Then someone thought the best use of my skills was to freeze me like a TV dinner. As they caught their breath, Thalassa and Arcturus simultaneously turned to check their surroundings. The landscape was as inviting as a dentist's chair and equally filled with potential for pain. "Right," Thalassa said, peering at the horizon. "We need to find a way to amplify our signal. The half-baked distress call we sent might not even make it past Mars' atmospheric static, let alone reach someone willing to care." Arcturus nodded, his gaze scanning the horizon for anything resembling an ancient antenna or some other tech relic they could scrounge. Assuming someone out there still has ears to hear and fingers not too busy pointing triggers to respond. "Optimism suits you," Thalassa quipped. Like a tux on a cockroach. The wind kicked up, throwing red dust into their faces with all the friendliness of a slap. Thalassa wiped her visor clean, her eyes catching a glint of something metallic in the distance. "Over there," she pointed, "might be worth a look, or it could be another pile of junk. But hey, better than standing here waiting for obsidian to turn us into performance art." Arcturus squinted at the glint, then nodded. "Lead the way, Dr. Quill. If we die, at least we'll have something to blame." With that sterling vote of confidence, they made their way across the rugged terrain, each step an exercise in hope and futility. The Martian soil crunched under their boots, a gritty reminder of the countless failed human endeavors that had ground to dust here. As they approached, it became apparent that the glint was indeed a piece of old Earth technology, an ancient relay station, now as decrepit as the rest of humanity's Martian dreams. "Looks like someone's sad attempt at making long-distance calls," Arcturus muttered, eyeing the rusted structure. "Think it still works?" "Only one way to find out," Thalassa replied, moving toward the console with a determination born of desperation. The console was a museum piece, all knobs and levers, its interface designed by someone who clearly hated users. Thalassa fiddled with it, her fingers nimble from years of practice, and the knowledge that failure wasn't an option. Arcturus kept watch, eyes on the horizon for any sign of obsidian or his drone lackeys. The alien operative had a reputation that made even the bravest think twice. A shapeshifter wasn't something you wanted tailing you, especially one as skilled at turning a chase into a murder mystery with you as the victim. "Got it," Thalassa announced, a hint of triumph in her voice. "Boosted signal. If anyone's listening, Earth might just hear us now. Assuming they haven't all gone to hell in our absence." "Good," Arcturus replied. "Now we just have to survive long enough for that to matter." Their brief moment of victory was cut short as a shadow passed overhead, the sudden darkness a chilling reminder of the danger they were in. Thalassa looked up to see a drone circling, its mechanical gaze sweeping across the landscape like a spotlight in a prison yard. "Looks like we've overstayed our welcome," she said, her tone grim. Arcturus grabbed her arm, pulling her into motion. "Time to go. I prefer my encounters with Obsidian to be imaginary. They sprinted away from the relay station, moving as quickly as the rocky terrain allowed. The drone's hum grew louder, a constant reminder of the impending doom that came with a side of alien vendettas. Think the signal got through. Arcturus shouted over the wind and the mechanical buzzing. Let's hope so, Thalassa panted. I'd rather not have come back from the dead just to play hide-and-seek with a homicidal extraterrestrial. As they ran, the sound of the drone was joined by another, a low, throaty growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Thalassa's heart skipped a beat. Obsidian was close. I'd say we've got company, Arcturus said, his voice tense. And not the friendly kind. They dashed into a narrow ravine, the walls closing around them like a vice. The narrow passage was both a blessing and a curse. It offered some cover from above, but it was also a dead end if the drones decided to block the exit. Got any more of those genius inventions in your pocket? Thalassa asked, trying to inject humor into the dire situation. Fresh out, Arcturus replied. Unless you've got a secret stash of explosives you forgot to mention. Damn, Thalassa said. And here I thought we were going to bond over blowing things up. They pressed on, the ravine twisting and turning like a snake. The sound of the drones faded slightly, but Obsidian's presence was like a shadow at their backs, a constant, chilling reminder of their pursuer. Any bright ideas? Thalassa asked as they paused to catch their breath, the ravine ending in a steep climb. Climb and hope, Arcturus suggested. Or we could just stand here and ask Obsidian for a cup of tea when he arrives. Climb it is, Thalassa said, starting up the rocky wall with as much enthusiasm as one can muster while being pursued by a deadly alien. The climb was brutal, each handhold and foothold a test of endurance and will. But adrenaline is a hell of a drug, and fear makes for a great motivator when death is on the line. They reached the top, gasping for breath, their limbs screaming in protest. The view from the top was as desolate as the rest of the planet, a reminder that Mars was less a place for hope and more a field for broken dreams. Looks like we're still the galaxy's favorite underdogs, Thalassa said, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and defiance. For now, Arcturus agreed, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. But Obsidian won't give up easily. As if in response, the air around them seemed to shiver, a ripple of energy that set Thalassa's teeth on edge. She turned to Arcturus, worry etched across her face. That can't be good, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No, it can't, Arcturus replied, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. He's here, isn't he? They both knew it wasn't a question. Obsidian was close, and his presence was as palpable as the chill wind biting through their suits. We've got to keep moving, Thalassa said, determination hardening her voice. We didn't come this far to become footnotes in some alien's victory speech, Arcturus nodded, his resolve matching hers. Let's find some cover, regroup, and figure out our next step. With that, they moved away from the cliff edge, seeking shelter among the rocks. The landscape was a maze, and they were determined to stay one step ahead of their relentless pursuer. As they settled into the shadows, Thalassa couldn't help but chuckle, a grim humor bubbling to the surface. You know, I never thought I'd miss the cryopod. At least in there, I didn't have to worry about being hunted by intergalactic bounty hunters. Arcturus smirked, leaning back against a rock. Yeah, but then you'd miss all the fun of running for your life. Besides, what's a little existential dread between friends? True, Thalassa agreed, her smile a brief flicker in the gloom. But if we survive this, I'm demanding a vacation. Somewhere without aliens, Martian ruins, or homicidal drones. Deal, Arcturus said, his grin widening. But first, let's make sure we live long enough to book those tickets. With the weight of their predicament pressing down on them, they settled into their temporary refuge, their minds already working on the next plan. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a spark, a shared resolve that refused to be snuffed out, even by the darkest horizons. And as long as that spark remained, they would keep fighting, keep hoping, and keep laughing in the face of the abyss. Because if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was being stubbornly, defiantly alive. Arcturus leaned against the jagged rock, the Martian wind clawing at his suit like an overeager cat. "Well, Thalassa, how do you fancy our odds against a shape-shifting alien with a penchant for murder?" Thalassa peered over the rim of their rocky hideout, her eyes scanning for any hints of Obsidian's arrival. "I'd say our chances lie somewhere between slim and none," she replied, her voice drier than the barren landscape. "But then, I suppose optimism is overrated. Besides, I've always been partial to David and Goliath stories. If only we had a slingshot," Arcturus quipped, checking the charge on his outdated blaster. It was the kind of weapon that would probably malfunction if you looked at it wrong, but in a pinch, it was better than harsh language. A metallic rumble echoed across the canyon, causing the hair on the back of Arcturus's neck to stand on end. "Guess that's our cue." I'd hoped for a little more time to get my affairs in order. Clear my browser history before the end. Thalassa smirked, though her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Priorities, Arcturus. I'm sure that'll be the first thing they check after we're reduced to a smear on the Martian rocks." "Speaking of priorities," Arcturus said, squinting at a distant figure, "I think our boy has arrived." Obsidian emerged from the dust like a specter, his form shifting and shimmering as if reality couldn't quite make up its mind about him. One moment he was a towering humanoid, the next a sinuous shadow that defied description. "There's something poetic about being hunted by a creature that can't choose an outfit," Thalassa mused, her sarcasm a thin veneer over the adrenaline. "Yeah, well, I'd rather not be the subject of Obsidian's next fashion statement. Let's move." They slid down the far side of the ridge, feet scrabbling for purchase on the loose gravel. The descent was anything but graceful, but then grace wasn't high on their list of survival skills. Behind them, Obsidian's form flickered, adapting to the terrain with unsettling ease. He was gaining, and they both knew it. "Okay, plan A isn't working," Arcturus admitted, breathless as they hit the valley floor. "Got any plan BS up your sleeve?" "Surprisingly, I left my plan B in my other jacket," Thalassa shot back. "But if we can reach that facility," she pointed to a crumbling structure a few hundred yards away, "we might find something useful, like a nice door to lock behind us, or a bomb to blow us all to kingdom come. Either seems preferable right now." They sprinted toward the facility, their feet pounding against the unyielding Martian surface. Obsidian's pursuit was relentless, his shifting form a nightmarish dance in their periphery. The entrance to the facility yawned wide, a dark mouth ready to swallow their hopes whole. Inside, the building was a monument to humanity's failed ambitions, the remnants of another era gathering dust and rust. "Any chance this place has working defenses?" Arcturus asked as they dashed inside, the echo of their footfalls a grim reminder of how empty the world had become. "With our luck, probably not," Thalassa replied, her tone betraying a hint of desperation. "But maybe we can find something to rig up." They skidded to a halt in what had once been a control room. The ancient technology was a jumble of wires and panels, as antiquated as a rotary phone in a world of telepathy. "What do you think?" Arcturus asked, eyeing the machinery with skepticism. "Can you work with this junk?" Thalassa's fingers danced over the controls, a practiced touch that belied the chaos around them. "I think I can make it do something." Whether or not it's helpful remains to be seen. A flicker of power surged through the room, the lights flickering to life with an almost apologetic hum. Consoles blazed into reluctant existence, their screens displaying readouts from a time when humanity still dared to dream. "Not bad," Arcturus said, a thin smile on his lips. "If we live through this, I'll buy you a drink." "Hell, I'll buy you the whole damn bar." "Don't make promises you can't keep," Thalassa shot back, her focus on the controls as she tried to coax the ancient systems into compliance. Outside, Obsidian was closing in, his presence a constant pressure on their nerves. The alien's form was now a swirling mass of darkness, a harbinger of doom that defied the laws of physics and sanity. "Almost there," Thalassa muttered, her fingers flying over the keys. "Just a little more." A sudden tremor shook the facility, dust cascading from the ceiling like a grim snowfall. Arcturus glanced at Thalassa, his expression grim. "What did you do?" Thalassa's eyes widened as she stared at the screen. "I might have triggered the self-destruct." "You might have," Arcturus echoed, incredulous. "As in, there's room for doubt. I didn't have time to check the manual. Okay, we should probably run." "Running sounds good," Arcturus agreed, already moving toward the exit. They bolted from the control room, the walls reverberating with a deep, ominous rumble that promised nothing good. Behind them, Obsidian followed, his form coiling with menace. The facility was a warren of corridors, each turn a gamble in their bid for survival. The countdown echoed in Thalassa's mind, a relentless drumbeat driving them forward. "Why is it that every time I wake up from a century-long nap, things go to hell?" Thalassa wondered aloud, breathless from exertion and adrenaline. "Consider it a cosmic joke," Arcturus replied, his voice tight with tension. "One we're not laughing at." The exit loomed ahead, a rectangle of daylight that beckoned them toward freedom, or at least a temporary reprieve. They burst into the open air, the Martian dust swirling around them as the facility shuddered, a dying giant in its final throes. Obsidian was right behind them, his presence a chilling promise of violence. "Now what?" Arcturus asked, glancing back at the approaching doom. "Now we hope the cavalry heard our call," Thalassa replied, her gaze fixed on the sky. As if in answer, the air was filled with a deafening roar, the kind of sound that heralds salvation or obliteration. A formation of Earth ships descended through the atmosphere, their sleek forms bristling with weaponry. "Looks like someone out there still likes us," Arcturus said, relief evident in his voice. "Or they just hate Obsidian more," Thalassa countered, though a smile tugged at her lips. The ships unleashed a barrage of firepower, the sky alight with fury and destruction. Obsidian's form writhed under the onslaught, his shape flickering as if reality itself rebelled against him. "Think that'll be enough?" Arcturus wondered, his eyes on the battle above. "I hope so," Thalassa replied, watching as their alien pursuer dissolved under the relentless barrage. "Because I'm fresh out of ideas." As the dust settled, the ships hovered overhead, a protective presence against the hostile world. A voice crackled over their comms, the sound like a lifeline in the silence. "This is Earth Defense. We received your signal. Stand by for extraction." Thalassa let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Looks like we live to fight another day," she said, a weary grin on her face. "Yeah," Arcturus agreed, his eyes finally leaving the sky to meet hers. "And maybe next time we can do it with a little less running and a little more drinking." "Deal," Thalassa replied, extending a hand. Arcturus took it, the gesture a simple promise in a world gone mad. As they awaited their ride off the barren rock, they shared a moment of quiet victory, united by the stubborn, irrepressible spirit that had brought them this far. Because even in the darkest corners of the universe, humanity refused to go quietly into the night. And for Thalassa and Arcturus, that was more than enough. As the dust settled, Arcturus and Thalassa found themselves standing amidst the wreckage of what was once a thriving Martian colony, now reduced to a series of crumbling ruins, and the occasional, still flickering neon, "Welcome to Mars" sign. You'd think after all this time someone would have pulled the plug on those, but apparently old habits die hard, just like humanity's fascination with cheesy decor. The Earth defense ships hovered above, their engines a reassuring hum in the desolate landscape. Arcturus waved up at them with the enthusiasm of a man who'd just been handed a winning lottery ticket, only to realize it was for free broccoli for life. "I can't believe we survived," he said, turning to Thalassa with a grin that bordered on manic. "I was almost certain we were going to end up as a footnote in some Martian archaeology textbook. Here lies two idiots who thought they could outrun a shape-shifting alien." Thalassa chuckled, her eyes scanning the horizon for any lingering threats. We might still get that honor, but at least we'd get a page all to ourselves. A voice crackled through their comms, reminding them they weren't entirely alone in this cosmic hellhole. You two lovebirds ready for pickup, or do you need a moment to take in the scenery? Scenery's overrated, Arcturus replied, tapping his helmet's visor. And who you calling lovebirds? We're more like two people who were thrown together by fate and a mutual desire not to die. Touching, the voice replied, dripping with sarcasm. But we've got orders to stabilize this sector. Extractions inbound, sit tight. Thalassa sighed, her breath misting in the suit's visor. Just when I thought I was done with cramped spaces and recycled air. At least now, there's the promise of a drink at the end of it. I hear Earth makes a mean synthetic whiskey, Arcturus joked as they began to move towards the open hatch of the rescue ship. It almost tastes like the real thing, provided you've got no taste buds left. They climbed into the ship, the heavy door sealing behind them with a definitive clunk. The interior was functional, all gleaming metal and harsh lighting, a stark contrast to Mars' rusty embrace. Soldiers bustled about, checking systems and exchanging the kind of banter that suggested they'd seen worse and were still slightly pissed about it. "Welcome aboard," one of them said, nodding to Thalassa and Arcturus. "Make yourselves at home, but try not to touch anything important. Last thing we need is you blowing us all to hell again." "Good to know we have a reputation," Thalassa quipped, taking a seat across from Arcturus. "Though I have to admit, it's not quite the way I imagined my return to the land of the living." As the ship ascended, Mars shrank to a red dot behind them, not quite as imposing when viewed from a safe distance. For a moment, Arcturus felt a pang of nostalgia, or maybe that was just the motion sickness setting in. Space travel had a way of jostling both your organs and your emotions. "Still think about going back?" Thalassa asked, reading his expression with the kind of precision that usually came from years of knowing someone rather than days. "Sometimes," he admitted, shrugging. "But truth be told, I've got more ties to dust than to earth. Figure there's more to discover here and fewer people telling me what to do." Thalassa leaned back, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "And if you had to choose between staying here with Mars dust or heading back to Earth's crumbling glory, you offering to stick around and keep me company?" Arcturus countered, a lopsided smile on his lips. "Because I'm starting to think it might just swing my vote." She laughed, the sound like a bell in the ship's sterile confines. "You might regret that. I'm not exactly known for my peaceful coexistence with others." "You saying we'd argue?" he asked, feigning surprise. "Impossible. We're the picture of harmony." The banter in the ship's cabin continued as they soared through space, the monotony broken only by the occasional turbulence and the hum of the engines. The crew seemed unfazed by their presence, more preoccupied with their own duties and the endless grind of survival. A thought nagged at Thalassa, her mind refusing to settle even as they drew closer to the promise of Earth's chaotic embrace. "What do you think's happening down there?" she asked, gesturing vaguely to the planet now visible through the viewport. Same old," Arcturus replied with a dismissive wave. "Political infighting, resource wars, and a few more apocalypses for good measure." "Barely noticed we were gone, I bet." "You have such a way with words," Thalassa said dryly. "A real comfort in these trying times." Arcturus shrugged. "Just calling it like I see it. The world's a mess, and we're just a couple of loose threads trying not to get tangled." The ship began its descent, the atmosphere burning around them like a cosmic blaze of glory, or a fiery reminder of how close they'd come to being reduced to atoms. The pilot's voice crackled over the comms, a calm presence in the swirling chaos outside. "Prepare for landing," he said, his tone more bored than concerned. "And try not to puke on the seats. They're new." The impact was jarring, the kind that rattled teeth and bones alike. But they were down, and compared to the chaos they'd left behind, it felt like a minor miracle. As they disembarked, the familiar chaos of an Earth landing zone unfolded around them. Organized chaos, of course, with soldiers, medics, and officials bustling about like ants on a sugar high. Thalassa and Arcturus were ushered through the throng, their status as survivors earning them a fast track through the bureaucracy. "So, what now?" Arcturus asked as they finally stepped into the relative peace of a debriefing room, the door closing behind them with a soft hiss. Thalassa considered the question, her gaze drifting to the world outside the window. Earth was a patchwork of beauty and decay, the scars of humanity's failures etched into its surface like a grim reminder of the cost of ambition. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've had enough of sleeping through the disaster du jour. Mars might be a wreck, but it's got potential, and I'd like to see what we can make of it." Arcturus nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "Could be a fresh start." "For both of us." "Exactly," Thalassa agreed, a spark of determination in her eyes. "And maybe, between the two of us, we can keep the place from falling apart entirely." They stood there for a moment, two figures against the backdrop of a world that had seen better days but wasn't quite ready to give up the ghost. In each other they found the promise of something more, something worth fighting for, even if it meant risking everything all over again. As they turned to leave, the echoes of their footsteps a rhythmic promise of future adventures, Arcturus flashed a grin at Thalassa. "You know, if this whole Martian reconstruction project works out, I might just have to propose." Thalassa rolled her eyes, a playful smirk curving her lips. "You do realize proposals require more than just surviving multiple attempts on our lives, right?" "Who said anything about surviving?" Arcturus quipped. "I'm just hoping for a chance to steal one last dance before the universe decides to pull the rug out from under us again." "Forever the optimist," she teased as they stepped out into the open air, where the winds of Earth carried with them the scent of possibility. "Hey," Arcturus shrugged, "after Mars, anything's possible." As they walked away from the chaos of the landing zone, the future lay before them, a canvas of red dust and broken dreams, waiting for them to make something of it. Together, they faced the unknown with the kind of reckless courage that defined humanity, one small step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find a little happiness along the way, even if it was wrapped in a layer of Martian dust and grim determination. After all, in a universe that thrived on chaos and unpredictability, it was the small victories that mattered most.